Welcome, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today about when exactly your Agile transformation is done. The quotes on this page really talk a little bit about the conversations that we've been having with our clients and with organizations who are going through Agile transformations. And whereas in the past, the conversation was often based on beginning an Agile transformation or stabilizing and perhaps accelerating the results of an Agile transformation, invariably nowadays, there's almost this intention of sharing how long a transformation has been running. So an organization might say how many years they've been following Agile practices and using an Agile mindset. Or just as equally, they may talk about the number of projects or the percentage of projects they now deliver using an Agile way of working, the number of teams that are using Agile. And as we listen to that sort of appreciation or description of where organizations are, that raises a number of questions about exactly what it means to be either complete in terms of delivering an Agile transformation, or even partway through what that might look like. And almost certainly it isn't to do with the percentage of teams or projects which are delivering Agile, or even how long you've been practicing Agile. And it's certainly not simply tied to whether or not your Agile transformation budget has been funded and completed, or whether it's still in progress. If you ask an Agile coach how to manage Agile transformations, a common mantra you will hear is outcome over output. And certainly I've been guilty of that in the past. Today, I think that's a bit of a dated approach. In the past, if you're moving from a traditional way of delivering software, that traditional way of delivering software really only gets an outcome after, say, 6 or 12 or 18 months. So in those cases, the focus in measuring success tends to be focused on activity or output. Today, more and more organizations are already applying Agile practices. They're delivering software more frequently. And so this mix of outcome versus output is a trivialization of what we want to look at. In the case of football, if I use football or soccer as an analogy, it's this difference between outcome and output can be seen in any of us who follow major sports, such as Major League Soccer or the Premier League in the UK. Until a few years ago, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, the outcome of the game was really the only metric that we considered: who won, who lost, who scored more goals, who scored less goals. And there was certainly a focus on assists. So that is whoever fed the ball to the person who scored the goal. But there was really very little in the way of other data or statistics around the game. Today, when you watch the game, there are thousands, literally thousands of different data points which are tracked for every player on the field. You can go to Opta's website and look at any game across North America, South America, and across Europe, and see thousands of statistics per game, per player, about shots on goal, about recoveries or interceptions, about big chance scoring or other data that will tell you much, much more about how the game is played and what quality of team that you're working with. What I'll be talking about through this presentation is really three things. First of all, I want to deconstruct an Agile transformation. I want to break it down into some of its constituent parts, and I'm going to use a concept called Wardley Maps to introduce you to that. So there's a sort of a brief introduction to Wardley Maps as part of that deconstruction of the Agile transformation. Once we understand what makes up an Agile transformation, I'm going to start looking at Agile delivery in particular and try and look at how we might measure that Agile delivery. And I'm going to introduce you to ideas like OKRs, objectives and key results, and introduce you to ideas that are much more familiar to us, such as KPIs or key performance indicators, and of course, service level agreements or SLAs. And I'll try and explain at what point you use each type of metric when looking at your Agile delivery capability as an example. Finally, I'd like to end with a focus on business agility. Any Agile transformation has to positively impact your business. And so I want to talk about a couple of the things that you would look at in terms of understanding the impact of Agile transformation on your business. So let's start by deconstructing your Agile transformation. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to walk you through a high-level creation of a Wardley Map. Wardley Map itself really is a way of mapping out your business on the canvas that you can see on the right-hand side of the slide. This sort of two axes, the x-axis and the y-axis. The x-axis describes the evolution or the maturity of your capabilities, and the y-axis describes what's called the value chain, from high value at the top, visible to the end user or your customer, down to the components which have value. They're parts of your value chain, but they're not very visible to the end user. So where we're going to start is understanding your end user or customer. The top of the y-axis, the very highest point on the y-axis, is where we start with the customer's needs. This is what they're looking for out of any product or service that you might deliver. And as you can see in the example that we have here, having identified our end user or customer, I'm putting our customer needs as being delighting the customer, or hopefully surprising the customer, positively surprising the customer. You're going to put the needs that your customers are looking for you to solve, or what your products and services are actually delivering. Now that we've identified what our customers' needs are, we're going to look down into the value chain to understand all of the constituents, the components that allow us, our business, to deliver those products or services to the customer. So specifically, we start off with things which are very visible to the customer. You can think of these as the products or services that they're buying, the product that they receive in the post, or the website and the application that they're using. These are very, very visible parts of the value chain, and the customers recognize these. These are what they go out and buy and search for and use. But in order for you to deliver those services, you have other elements of the value chain that have to contribute to that. So an example I've captured under business agility is that sort of sales and marketing, customer service, the elements that stitch together in your organization to deliver that product or service. And as I go deeper into that value chain, I then step into that area of product ownership or product management. And product ownership, product management is sort of translating those business or customer needs into something that your technology groups can understand, build, and deliver against. And then as you go deeper into the value chain, and remember, as you go deeper, these become less and less visible, less and less meaningful to your end users. So you'll then hit Agile delivery services, for example. And then finally, the Agile delivery teams are building something and releasing, deploying them onto some sort of infrastructure, and some operations team then takes care of those and runs them. And as you can imagine, as a customer, I really only care about what I can see at the top of that value chain. But as a company, we need all parts of that value chain working well in order to deliver, meet, and even exceed customers' needs and expectations. The final part of creating the basic Wardley map is pushing out those different components along the x-axis. And the x-axis basically describes how well evolved or mature those practices are. So if I take an example of data centers, with a data center decades ago, there were no companies that offered data center services. Instead, you had to find the real estate. You had to buy a mainframe from one of the few manufacturers who would then ship that mainframe to you. And you're building that data center yourself in your own premises, probably with your own skills. It's very much a custom, or it's an innovative idea. And that's the genesis and the custom part of that evolution pathway. In the genesis piece, think of that as innovation. You're the only people trying to do what you're doing at that point. As the market expands, as more and more competitors come into that marketplace, you might move to a slightly more mature interpretation of those capabilities, where they're more custom-based services. So there is a bit more repeatability. You may have a data center on different regional hubs. You may have multiple data centers, or begin building out and partnering with people who can help you out there. As the concept of data centers becomes more common, you can move to the right again. And now you're in that product rent or buy space. And you know you're getting maturity there when you can start going to the market and buying the services that you're trying to use. So again, you can imagine IBM, for example, providing data center services to a lot of different organizations back in the 90s and early 2000s. And in more recent years, as you move on to the right, you end up commoditizing those data center services. And this is really kind of kick-started with AWS, Amazon Web Services, and now you've got Google Cloud, and you've got Microsoft Azure, you've got AWS. There are many, many providers who are providing things in the cloud that move a data center away from something that we take care of within our organization to something that we buy at the lowest price, effectively, when it's a commodity-based service. And so that evolution axis is very interesting because it moves over time from left to right. So what we're going to see is we migrate different components or capabilities. Those capabilities will place themselves in different spots. So in the map that I'm drawing there, you're looking at business agility, even product ownership as being something that let's say that's something that is custom now. Every organization has a different interpretation of what product ownership or product management looks like in an agile world. Business agility is also just emerging right now. The appreciation or understanding of what underpins enterprise or business agility is not yet locked down. So we're emerging those practices. But once you get to agile delivery services, so core, sprints, Scrum teams, Kanban teams, whatever they may be, agile delivery service is well understood. In fact, it's comfortably past custom. It's in that sort of product space. And even in some ways, you could imagine it moving towards a commodity space. So in terms of evolutionary terms, agile delivery services are well understood. And you can literally imagine going to the market, and there are companies that will do this today, and buying agile delivery service sprint by sprint, team by team. So there are companies that will say, we've got a development team. You can buy one sprint of that development team. You can buy 10 sprints of that development team. But they have that ability now to offer agile delivery services for rent, if you like. Finally, I want to touch on DevOps and infrastructure. DevOps and infrastructure is without a doubt firmly moving into the commodity space. What that means is you pretty much don't look after your own cloud services. You're going to buy it from the market. You'll lease it or rent it. It's almost like water. You turn the tap on and turn it off in order to get the infrastructure and services that you're needing. It's not fully commoditized right now, but it's well on the way in that direction. So as I summarize the Wardley map that we've created, one of the things to recognize is, of course, that every organization is at a different spot. They're at a different place in terms of that maturity. So rather than the dots that you saw on the previous graph, what you can see on this Wardley map is more of a range. There's a span of understanding or a span of maturity. And while things like an understanding of business agility and enterprise agility hasn't really got past the genesis or custom space, product ownership is kind of stretching out of custom into standards being built up around what a product owner, what a product management group might look like in an agile context. But by the time we get down to those components lower in that value chain, the standards have been established. It's well understood how to launch agile delivery services. When you look at DevOps or infrastructure, the way you structure and architect that is very, very well understood. And in fact, many organizations now don't give any mind share or thought to deliver the DevOps or infrastructure side, and they just use infrastructure, even DevOps capabilities as a service that they can just build their own ideas on top of. So what we're looking at here is, having deconstructed that agile transformation, we see a couple of things. There are two axes that we care about. Number one is your agile transformation may impact the whole value chain, or it may only impact one or two components of that value chain. The second thing is, depending on where you start in terms of the maturity of a given component, kind of explains a little bit about how your agile transformation will need to progress with time. And so therefore, how we can measure that component over time. This brings us to the next part. So now that I've deconstructed the agile transformation, I want to move on to looking at just one component, which is the agile delivery services. And I want to use Agile delivery services and literally that span of maturity that you can see in the graph before. And I want to consider how we might measure what's going on from an Agile transformation perspective in the Agile delivery services domain. Now, what we're going to find is, as you might expect, what we measure depends on the maturity or the position we are in that evolutionary axis. So what you can see here is that picture of the span of the Agile delivery services on our evolution axis. And as you can see, it kind of goes all the way from custom on the left-hand side, right through to touching commodity on the right-hand side. Again, that will depend a lot on where you come from, what position you're in and what industry sector you're in. So the first thing for us to understand about whether we are done, is our Agile transformation complete, is the answer that it depends. What are you trying to achieve? We need, first of all, to understand where we are and where we need to get to. And again, what I like about the Wardley Map representation is we can start understanding a little bit about where we need to be. So for example, if you're an e-commerce provider, your business is e-commerce and you're competing directly with the Walmarts and the Amazons of this world, then you'd better be a long way to the right. Because in Agile delivery services and DevOps, Amazon, Walmart, and other competitors that you're competing with are very firmly high performers, elite performers far over to the right. So in order to compete, you'll need to be in the same area. But equally, if you're a utilities or say a telecommunications or financial institution, you may not need to go as far over to the right. So that first piece is, it depends. You need to know what you're trying to achieve. The second part is, are you moving all of your components, or are you focused maybe just on one or two elements of that value chain? There are many organizations that start their Agile transformation in Agile delivery. They're struggling with the history of how software and product has been delivered in the past, and they want to see Agile delivery services strengthen in their organization. What typically follows then is the consequence is that immediately or very rapidly impacts infrastructure and DevOps. So that becomes the second component that people focus on. And more now, we're seeing organizations start to talk about product ownership and product management and the need, now that Agile delivery, now that DevOps is well understood and is functioning in a much improved state, then the pressure or the spotlight, if you like, turns to product ownership. So it really depends on, are you trying to shift all of the components at once, or are you trying to shift one or other of the components and understanding that? I've talked a little bit about that fit for purpose piece, and that's really just understanding what your competitors are doing and how much to the right you need to move your capabilities and the components. And the final point I wanted to make here in terms of when are we done is perhaps the simplest way of understanding this is looking at this from the perspective of making sure you're better off than when you started. Now, I'd like to be much better off than when you started, because obviously you've invested time and energy and money in order to get there. So you need to get some win for it, but you at least have to be able to exceed your performance levels that you had before you started. An important part of understanding your growth from left to right on an evolution axis are maturity models. Maturity models allow you to apply what you've learned in a consistent manner, scale it across your organization, duplicate the learnings that you have in one part of the organization in a lot of the Agile delivery capability, for example, across your organization. Now, what you see on this slide here is the definition of a maturity model from Wikipedia. So maturity models tend to focus on disciplines, on key disciplines. So think of these as those components in the value chain. And the challenge I have with maturity models is not the actual maturity model itself. I think maturity models have a lot of value in, and as I've said, scaling and sharing, duplicating learnings across an organization. They're also essential in the case of continuously improving and learning to make those disciplines stronger and stronger. The real challenge I have with maturity models is that we're now in a world which is increasingly complex, where capabilities grow and change and morph all the time. And the headache with that is if we only focus on maturity models, we end up in a place where we're really, really good at a discipline that may not be relevant in the market any longer. And what you can see here on this slide is the capability maturity model, or CMMI. CMMI is probably the grandfather of all of the maturity models. Most maturity models that have emerged since then are really based on the backbone that CMMI put together back in the 90s. It was actually worked on between 87 and 97. Version 1.1 was released in 2002, and there's been new versions of that kind of adopting and adapting to the changes in IT delivery over the many years since then. The capability maturity model itself consists of three key areas. And the first one is really I have no idea what we're doing, but we're reacting to what our customers need. So this is, in many organizations, there's no understanding or appreciation that there are standard ways of doing the work that they're doing. They're just reacting to what the customers are needing. And they're solving the problems as fast as they come to them, as quickly as they can. As organizations recognize that there are common practices and that there are best practices that we can learn from, then we move to the second phase of maturity models. And this is defined in this case here by the managed and defined elements of the maturity model. This is where we start defining roles and responsibilities. Processes get documented, standards are established, and tools and templates are rolled in to that process. So what used to be something that was very organic becomes something that is repeatable and fixed and standardized in many ways. And as I said, there will be roles, project managers or product owners. There'll be responsibilities that those roles take care of, standard practices, common approaches that we expect them to use, and so on. And this is the period, this stage in any maturity model when those common practices are captured and standardized and applied across an organization. And then there's the third part of any maturity model, which is where you begin fine-tuning and optimizing that discipline or capability for the particular needs your organization has. And in the CMMI model that you see here, this starts with that quantitative management. You begin bringing statistics, data, much more data into the understanding of your process or your discipline. And as that data becomes more clear, and think back to the football analogy that I was using earlier on, Opta has introduced thousands of data points, which makes understanding and improving football teams much more of a science than the art it used to be. The same is true here. We're going to introduce more data and use that to continually optimize those processes and disciplines for the particular business or the particular challenges that we have working in the business that we're in. As you might expect, in the last 10 years or so, many agile maturity models have hit the market. There's just a handful of the ones that you can find online on this slide. All of these different agile maturity models pretty much follow the same approach. They have that understanding that you're kind of nowhere. We don't understand what our agile practice might look like. And then as we learn a little bit more, we go out to the market and understand there are common practices, and we're going to get those basic practices in place. We're going to then start increasing our fluency, becoming more consistent in our application of those practices, able to scale, duplicate them across multiple teams and multiple locations and products. And then finally, we get into that optimization, the continually learning and continually improving part of a maturity model. The headache with maturity models is that they only cover a part of that span of the evolution axis. And so when we're looking at maturity models, we have to not see getting to the top of a maturity model as the end goal. We have to recognize it as another step in that journey towards a true agile transformation. So let's use the Wardley Map structure to try and understand how we might measure and how we might use maturity models and other ways of measuring progress throughout that evolution axis. So what we're going to see is early on in the evolution axis, in the genesis and some of the custom stage, we are going to use the outcomes over output model. we're really going to focus on the objectives that we're trying to achieve, the outcomes that we want to achieve. And the reason we have to do that is we don't know what the best practices are. We don't know what the good practice, common practices are in order to deliver those outcomes. So having objectives or metrics which are focused on the practices doesn't make sense. In fact, it can lead us astray if we pick the wrong practices. As we move to the right now from custom into product space on the evolution or maturity axis, this is where the maturity models come to the fore. Maturity models are going to allow us to grow our capability rapidly. We may as well follow the path other organizations have already followed and mapped out for us. And we're also going to end up in that world of KPIs, of key performance indicators. And as we're going to learn in a second, one of the key areas here is this is now where we can mandate performance. When we're looking at the objective-based, outcome-based, it's very difficult to mandate performance there because we're still learning. But in this central area, there are common practices and standards. The understanding is there. We can even hire people who've done it before. And so in this space, we're often going to mandate an outcome. We're going to decide, for example, that we're going to deploy every week or every month, whatever that might be. And then finally, as you move into the commodity stage on the evolution axis, this is where service level agreements become paramount. In the commodity space, if I look at something like data center availability, we're not just wanting to hit a key performance indicator in terms of database availability. We actually build our whole organization on the assumption that that availability will be there. And so in order to have that, we have to move away from key performance indicators into the world of service level agreements, of guaranteed delivery and guaranteed response times. We'll talk a little bit more about all three of these in the coming slides. OKRs, or objectives and key results, is one way, it is not the only way, of looking at outcome-based metrics. What I like about OKRs, and OKRs, by the way, has been popularized through John Doerr's book on Measure What Matters, and was really introduced through John Doerr working with Andy Grove at Intel. And OKRs have been adopted and put into practice by many of the Silicon Valley great companies like Google, and Zillow and things like this, as well as many other organizations worldwide. And the concept of OKRs kind of has a very specific meaning. First of all, we're going to identify our objective. What is it that we're trying to achieve? And that's the outcome. And then we're going to look at the number of outputs or activities that allow us to achieve that outcome in theory. And the key thing here is that those key results, the outputs that we're looking for, are hypothesized in the sense that we don't know that they will definitely achieve the outcomes or the objectives that we've identified, but we think they may. So in the case that you're looking at here, I've created an OKR for a product ownership or product management group. And as we all know, a product owner, their responsibility, the outcome that they're looking to achieve is to maximize return on investment for a product that they're working on. The key results might be that they're releasing something of value on a monthly basis to end users and customers. It might be that they're able to achieve a certain level of customer satisfaction. Maybe they're going to increase the customer satisfaction by 50 basis points. One of the things that you see here with the key results is they're quantitative. I can measure them. I'm going to meet them or I'm going to fail to meet them. And that's very important. And then the final one that you're seeing here is we're going to see some sort of customer engagement. They're going to spend more time with us, spend more money with us, whatever makes sense for you to measure in that context. Now, the reason that we would use OKRs here is we don't know for sure how things work. As I've said earlier on, product ownership is still an emerging practice. We have really good ideas of how product ownership and product management work, but we don't have a standard or a common practice that we can just apply from one industry to the next. So we're still learning. And what that means from an OKR perspective is two critical things. First of all, these are co-created with the people, the team that's going to deliver against those OKRs. So they work together to come up with these OKRs. The second thing that's critical here is they are not tied to compensation to performance measures or any of the other things that key performance indicators or other metrics are often used. And the reason for that is we're still learning. We actually want to fail to deliver in some of these key results, because failing to deliver teaches us something about the process and the practice that we're trying to learn about. So, for example, here we might find that we can't get a 50 basis point jump in customer satisfaction. We're only seeing, say, 20 basis points. So that's going to teach us a little bit more about what our end users or customers care about, what moves the needle in their area of, in their interpretation of customer satisfaction. But we don't know that until we try and move the needle and we try and measure it and see what's there. Those measures have compensation tied to them, then we're going to lower those numbers and try to protect ourselves just so that we're going to get the compensation tied to it. So as you can see here, for that early stage in the evolution, objective or outcome-based metrics are important, number one. OKRs are a great example, and I'll share some information about this online at a later stage if you want to find out more. And critically here, they're kind of outcome-based and co-created with the team, not tied to compensation. So now let's move away from the sort of genesis and custom piece into that central area and then the right-hand side, so product and commodity on the evolution axis. There are many different indicators or metrics that you can use to track progress in this area. And remember a couple of things that you might want to look for. One is maturity models provide a really good framework or backbone to show progress through custom into product and then commodity. Another thing that you might want to look for are standards which are emerging in the industry. And one of those standards has been driven by DORA, that is the DevOps Research and Assessment Group, founded by or definitely heavily influenced by Jez Humble, who's a great thought leader in this space. And DORA have identified the common practices that elite performers in Agile delivery and DevOps are using in the industry. Those, what's called the DORA metrics, they've identified 5 different numbers to kind of track progress in this area. And those range from software delivery concepts like lead time, the amount of time it takes to come up with an idea and get it in front of a customer, or even commit that change to a system and get that in front of a live customer, through to deployment frequency. How frequently can you push changes out? And then there are sort of more operational aspects. And there you get things like change fail, which is the percentage of changes or the proportion of changes that you make to your systems which fail or succeed. And you also get things like time to recover. If your change does fail, how fast can you recover from that and correct everything so your customer's experience is not degraded for too long at all. And then the final one that you see there is availability. Now, when I look at this sort of range of these 5 metrics, what strikes me here is that when you're starting on the left-hand side in that software development space and deployment, the service deployment, what we're looking at are key performance indicators. In a particular industry, you're going to have lead times, which are nowadays measured in hours or days rather than weeks or months. You're going to have deployment frequency, which again is counted in a number of deployments effectively per day for elite performance. And then you're going to see, as you keep moving over to the right, you're going to see fewer metrics that can really be considered key performance indicators and metrics that are merging into service level agreements. They're minimum expectations. So an example here, as I move through change fail, well, that's going to depend. It's a key performance indicator that we're looking for. But as I hit the time to recover and availability, these are the sorts of things that we're going to go to our operations, our DevOps teams, and we're going to insist that they maintain a certain level of availability, or we're going to insist that they can recover in a particular time frame. Depending on what we're doing, that time frame might be measured in hours or days. Again, really depends on the space that we're in, the industry segment that we're in. But these are not key performance indicators. They're not nice to have. There's something that we expect from the organizations, the departments that we're working with. So this shows that sort of migration of key performance indicators to service level agreements. So just as I summarize this sort of agile delivery element of it, maturity models span a lot of that evolution axis. And within that evolution axis, we're going to move on the left-hand side in that innovative sort of custom-built space. We're going to use outcome-based metrics. And I introduced the concept of OKRs as introduced by Andy Grove in Intel and sort of picked up and really pushed forward by Google in the early years as Google was growing. And then as you then pick up and you move into the product space and eventually the commodity space, you move into KPI territory, metrics, which are performance indicators in some way, and service level agreements. One of the key things remembering KPIs is these are often, they can be mandated simply because the standards that are there, the common practices are there, and we know what we have to achieve. Okay, let's just take a moment to look at where we are in the presentation. And what I'd like to do now, we've kind of deconstructed the Agile transformation. We used a Wardley Map representation of our organization at that point. We then moved to looking at metrics and measurement of Agile delivery or any individual capabilities. And we've introduced the idea that the metrics that you use really depend on where you are in that spectrum of maturity. We recognize that while maturity models provide direction and they provide a backbone that we can use to implement mature and common practices in an organization, we want to be careful of relying too heavily on those because we see rapid change and the discipline that you may be becoming mature in might not be relevant as you go forward. Now what I'd like to do is turn to the kind of ultimate outcomes, the business outcomes that we're looking for. And in this context, I'm going to revisit Wardley Maps and pull out one of the most powerful ideas from Wardley Maps in order to understand how we can get business results. The next idea that I want to introduce is how Wardley Maps have really shifted our thinking of business strategy. So the concept of a strategy of purpose and strategy of movement is something that Simon Wardley, the inventor of Wardley Maps, has articulated really, really well. His premise is that most organizations focus heavily on the strategy of purpose, why we are doing what we're doing, how we're meeting our customers' needs and why we're doing that. In reality, in order to achieve that strategy of purpose, we have to decide the kind of strategic direction, the strategic movement that we're going to make in order to achieve it. Think of any military campaign that we've read about, the famous military victories. And all of those victories start with one of the military commanders, often a successful military commander, having a map of the terrain and truly understanding how they can use that terrain to their advantage. Wardley Maps provides you that map of the terrain. And there are certain things that we can use, we can infer from that map of the terrain that we can then use to guide our actions. And that's the strategy of movement. So what you can see here is, if you remember, we created that Wardley Map and we had those components: product ownership, agile delivery, and infrastructure or DevOps. And we said that over time, there's going to be a move from left to right on the evolution axis. And this is one of the first things we need to appreciate around the strategy of movement. And that is the increasing maturity of the capabilities that we are using. So as an example, if we're only now introducing agile development practices to our organization, or they're very much still at the early stages of common practice, we have to recognize that the pressure of the market is accelerating that move to the right. And so for us, one of our goals might be that we need to accelerate that move to the right, or even leapfrog our competitors by moving as far to the right as we can reasonably do. This is one aspect of that strategy of movement, and it's the continual pressure of the competitive marketplace, the business marketplace that we work in, that moves those activities, those capabilities to the right-hand side. So given that strategy of movement, let's take a look at an agile transformation from our organization perspective, that kind of business agility perspective, and try and understand when we're done. And there's three things that we need to kind of look at here. And these are tied to those maturity model conversations that we had earlier. First of all, you've got to meet your objective. What were the original objectives of what your agile transformation is trying to achieve? We keep coming back to that. Now, with that lens of strategy of movement, we can now articulate that in terms of how far to the right we want our current practices to move. So are we wanting just to be able to introduce an agile delivery capability, or are we trying to become sort of a best of the rest, or even a best of a market leading agile delivery capability, which is far to the right-hand side? This will really depend a lot on what the needs are in your particular market. The second thing that we're worried about is the sort of growth and application of standard and common practices. This really comes around repeatable good practices that we can see from one team to the next, or one product to the next. So this begins to introduce those ideas of key performance indicators, for example, that are shared across many teams. So instead of having each team sort of make its own journey towards increasing agile capability, we're going to start seeing many teams all move up as they apply and share standard practices. And then the final thing is, if we can't scale and grow by adding new teams and being able to onboard those teams and get them practicing at the required level as fast as possible, then we're going to get held back. So that's the third measure that we might look at for whether or not we've really achieved a successful agile transformation as defined by that strategy of movement. Let me look at a couple of examples of that and how we might compare and use those KPIs going forward. So I talked about DORA earlier on, and DORA has a report out, 2019 State of DevOps report, that talks a lot about what elite performance versus average performers versus low performers are doing in terms of those 5 DORA metrics that I introduced earlier on. And what's really powerful about this is we now finally have that tie between organizational objectives and the achieving of those organizational objectives with the outputs, the practices that we see on our agile delivery teams. And as you can see from the quote on the slide, elite performers are twice as likely to achieve their organizational objectives, the goals of that organization, than low performers are. And elite performers are measured against the metrics that we talked about earlier on. So they're over 200 times shorter lead times. They have a deployment frequency that is literally thousands of times more frequent deployments than the low performers, and so on. And as you can see on here, these are KPIs, they're key performance indicators defined by the DORA metrics that are defining output, they're defining activities, they're defining those numbers that we care about, but that are how the work is being done. But they are also tied to the outcome of the organization, the ability to achieve the organization's goals. Now, in closing, I want to add one more idea around that strategy of movement. And that one idea is the idea that you can build on commoditized and productized, commercialized capabilities. So as we introduce new practices like Agile and DevOps practices, and as we get better and better and our organizations are shifting those over to the right, that opens up new opportunities. And so the way we see that is that green lines that you see on the graph here. This means that we can look back up in the Genesis area and further up the value chain, closer to something that is visible and recognizable by our end users and customers, and come up with new ideas, new offerings, new something to surprise and delight our customers with. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. In 2011, a design student from the UK called Thomas Thwaites chose to try and build an electric toaster from scratch. The electric toaster is quite an unusual thing. We all have electric toasters, I'm sure, in our kitchens. And in fact, we can buy one for $20 or $30 from many hardware stores. And yet, when you actually tease apart the electric toaster, there are many different components, over 400 components, Thomas Thwaites found out, that combine together to give us a very simple new product, which is the electric toaster. And the fact is that we could never have built the electric toaster at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The electric toaster is something that is only possible for us to build on the back of many, many other capabilities that have been developed and then commoditized over time, whether that is electrical power or iron and steel and able to tease out wires and components, electrical components that run that whole toaster. So this is this concept of standing on the shoulders of giants. We have a new horizon when we have commoditized capabilities that we've become very, very good at. And again, an example of this is Amazon Web Services from the story of Amazon, which emerged as a new offering that Amazon is able to offer because they became very, very good at managing their own systems and managing the scalability challenges that they had with the seasonal change in e-commerce. So when we look at this strategy of movement and mapped out by the Wardley Map concept that we've used to describe our agile transformation, one of the things that we want to look at in any organization is that move towards new invention of something beyond what your delivery, your capability is, or your organization is given to your customers today. Okay, in closing, I wanted to use an OKR format to kind of summarize how to track your agile transformation. The objective of your agile transformation should absolutely be to have some positive, meaningful impact on your business results. So that's what I've put in as that objective. And then there are 4 key results that you might want to try and measure against. The first one is obviously a tie to your actual business results. So how is the agile transformation tied to some sort of business, positive business outcomes? And keeping that front and center is important because too many organizations think being able to deliver in an agile way will somehow magically change those business results. And we want to be more determined or more explicit, I should say, in tying those two together. The second key result that we're looking at is now that we understand that evolution axis in the capabilities that we're trying to build up when we lead our agile transformation, we can start using the right metrics depending on where we are on that axis, whether it's outcome-based like OKRs, sort of more output-based around the key performance indicators, or whether there's even service level agreements, just base level functionality or that we need for the capabilities that we are building. The final 2 things that we're looking at, well, one of them is that we really want to understand that maturity or growth path that we're going through. So depending on the capabilities that we're growing, we want to either define or find from the marketplace maturity models that we can track our progress on. Those maturity models allow us to accelerate understanding and development in key disciplines. But be careful about relying purely on the maturity models as your primary measure of agile transformation success. The final one I wanted to introduce you to is this idea of invention, of seeking at least one invention where you're applying agile transformations in a different, unique way to the way you worked before. All the truly successful agile organizations that we've had the pleasure of working with have had realizations about opportunities they hadn't realized were there until they had an agile capability. And as soon as they recognize these, they've seen opportunities for increasing market share or growing profitability or just beating their competitors to market in key areas. And so whatever those inventions are, how they are applied, you want to definitely keep an eye on them. You want to be looking for them rather than hoping that they will emerge, and count those as part of that success measure for agile transformations. I hope you found a lot of interesting ideas in what's been presented today, and I look forward to following up with any questions you may have online through the duration of the conference. Thank you very much.